The journey to an aesthetic body is a lot like being thrown into a thick forest. Every so often, we can find a path that will get us somewhere, but we will eventually run into a place where it seems like the path runs in many different directions. And the initial path is very helpful in terms of having a direction to go, and we make progress. But when the path runs out, we're lost again. And this can lead us to walking in circles without making any real change or really getting much of anywhere. The body's default state is to stay in some form of balance for the sake of conserving energy in order to be able to thrive later on. To raise your body to a new default state, you have to do something different to stimulate your body to change. Your body adapts to the external and internal conditions that are either set by you or by the world around you. So it is your job to consistently set what adaptation you wish for it to adapt to. And the fitness industry especially is like the Amazon jungle in terms of information. Around every corner of YouTube, Reddit, Twitter, you're being fed the most optimal way of doing one thing or another. High volume, high intensity, low carb, high carb. It's literally endless. And there's even a subset that will tell you that eating testicles is what you need to do for the maximum amount of testosterone. And it's no wonder that we get to where we feel completely lost, especially after your initial newbie gains have halted. I spent the better part of about 3 years with the exact same physique despite everything I was trying out. I knew how to train hard, and I was eating enough protein after training, or at least I thought that's all that it took. After all, when we're training, we get told a lot of times, or at least led to believe that more is better, right? Just train harder, bro. Just get after it, bro. Grind, bro, 24/7, nonstop, no cap. And I guess it can work, but here's why it typically doesn't. Harder in terms of effort does not necessarily mean it's equally as effective. If your training is ineffective, then going harder is just going to make it just as ineffective, only you're more exhausted and even more frustrated. And this was me. I tried Kinobody's reverse pyramid style, German volume training, 5x5, and I still more or less kept the exact same look. I was in the gym 5 days a week, so I knew that consistency was there, but I had no fucking clue what the hell was going on. And I remembered this was a time that I opted to hire a coach that I knew had had success with their clients in the past, and I'd listened to their podcast, and I'd taken in a bunch of information, so I decided to give them a shot. And the funny part was that they looked at everything that I did and took overall workload away from what I was already doing and focused on the most foundational principles of resistance training. It wasn't reps and sets, it wasn't exercise, and it wasn't even what split to run. I'm talking first principles, the foundational principles that underlie all resistance and weight training. And once I was able to internalize these and learn from this coach, it made it 10 times easier to adjust my own programs so that I can continue to get consistent results on a month-to-month to year-to-year basis. And these principles that we're going to be looking at today are mechanical tension, strength curves of a muscle, resistance profiles, counterforce and stability, time under tension, and muscle fiber orientation. Taking all of these into account gave me a much better foundation in my understanding of exercise selection and minimum effective volume. And with me being lazy, I am looking for the minimum effective volume dose. And for this video, all of these foundations are exactly what we're going to go through. So let's get into mechanical tension. Mechanical tension refers to the pulling force generated within muscle fibers when they contract against resistance, resistance being the weight that we're trying to lift. This force is what ultimately allows us to move, exert force, and maintain posture. Within a muscle, there are groups of muscle fibers, and within these fibers, there are proteins known as actin and myosin. And during a contraction, actin and myosin overlap to attach to each other in varying amounts depending on how heavy the external force is. And so what these proteins do is they essentially overlap. If you think about it kind of like Velcro, the more that, all of the Velcro, teeth is what they call it or something, is over each other, and the harder it is to pull apart this way, right? It's kind of like friction. More friction means it's hard, it produces more energy, et cetera, et cetera. And at the level of these proteins, the goal is to try and get as many of these cross bridges to happen as we can within a set. And now this happens from relatively heavy loads. So if I just bring up my arm like this, there's not whole lot of actin and myosin cross bridging to happen. It requires an external force so that we can apply force back directly against it. And as you reach muscular failure within a set, more of these cross bridges happen as the brain continues to send signals to what's called motor units within these fibers to let a muscle know, hey, we're going to need more of these cross bridges to happen to produce more force so we can keep this weight moving. And this does not mean that more weight is better, right? Muscles are either stimulated to grow or they are not. They do not speak in terms of weight and load. They speak in terms of tension. And so once I understood this, I started prioritizing technique and leverage to maximize the amount of tension I could put across a particular fiber or muscle fibers, which led to much more effective training sessions in terms of hypertrophy. I started to have thoughts of like, how can I make an objective weight as subjectively hard as possible? And this is a great question to ask to start with in terms of hypertrophy. Now, once we understand this mechanical tension, how do we start to apply this to a certain muscle? And this brings me to strength curves. The goal of resistance training is to put tension across muscle fibers. And to do so, we have to identify the strength curve for each muscle so we can put a sufficient amount of tension into a muscle's fibers. The strength curve is the graphical representation of a muscle's ability to produce force varying lengths. This is a fancy way of saying that a muscle is stronger in certain positions over others. So typically, most muscles are going to be strongest in roughly their mid-range. And this is also where probably most gains are going to come from. So it's important to ask yourself questions like, where is my muscle in its fully lengthened position? Where is it in its completely shortened position? And where is it in its mid-range? Now, all of these are merely points on a continuum of a muscle's entire force production potential. And for me, this understanding allowed me to see how and why certain exercises may be better than others. And it allowed me to start the path of maximizing training a muscle because I started to see how certain points of a muscle in its strength curve can produce more force over other areas of training. Now, how to train these in different ranges brings us to understanding resistance profiles. And the goal of understanding resistance profiles, more or less, is to remove exercises that don't serve the purpose that you want, so junk exercises, and to minimize redundancies or things that, like, there's no sense in continuing to repeat it because maybe we're getting a little bit of junk volume in at that point, and we're leaving out potential other smaller gains on the table through these other muscle lengths. And so now that we know that a muscle can exert a certain amount of force at specific lengths, we have to examine and assign a resistance profile over the strength curve to get the most out of an exercise. So a resistance profile is a visual representation of the changes in torque or the force generated by muscles acting around a joint as they occur throughout a range of motion during an exercise. It essentially shows where a movement of it or where a part of an exercise feels heavier and where it feels lighter. So we first can use this information to understand what exercises are wasting our time in terms of not providing the stimulus we are seeking. And we have to select an exercise that challenges a muscle directly. If an exercise doesn't, then we should more or less remove it from a program. And so an exercise that I think of is like the horizontal plate press, and I think it's stupid dumb and not even worth it. Why? Because in the case of that exercise, gravity, as long as we're still on Earth, gravity is our external force acting against that weight when we push it out this way. And so if that is the case and our goal is to move against an external resistance, then if we're going to work the chest, then why wouldn't we want to work against gravity, not perpendicular to it? Which in that case, all of a sudden, if you just think of it like that, that turns the exercise into a front delt exercise, and it's not really that effective. But I contract super hard. Contracting hard doesn't mean you're stimulating anything. If this were the case, you could just flex your biceps and grow them to 20 inches, which we know isn't possible. And no like shade to anybody. I used to be in this boat. And so I completely understand this line of thinking. A lot of times we get told, like, oh, you got to feel the burn, you got to fill the muscle full of blood, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's providing adequate tension to elicit a hypertrophic response. Could in your newbie phase, but as you progress up to an intermediate to advanced intermediate, it's not going to do anything for you. Now, let's take a look at an exercise that isn't completely useless, but in my opinion, there are way better options available to you at your disposal. Let's look at the tricep kickback. So a tricep kickback loads the tricep in a way where the shoulder is extended and the elbow is extended, and it loads the tricep in its fully shortened position, which using what we know now about strength curves, we know is relatively weak and therefore cannot produce as much force. So in the tricep kickback, the dumbbell plays a varying role to challenge the tricep. At the beginning, there's little challenge at the elbow because of gravity. Your elbow's at 90 degrees, gravity's pushing straight down through your elbow, through your hand, into the dumbbell. And there's a tiny amount of challenge and force at the shoulder since the lats maintain and keep the shoulder in extension against the resistance of the dumbbell. So as we move through the arch of the kickback, the dumbbell increases its challenge on the triceps, but the triceps' ability to produce force diminishes as it approaches the shortened position or the fully flexed position. Now, when you start to think about it like this example allows you to see how understanding resistance profiles of exercises can help us assign what exercises to do in our program so that we can get a better bang for our buck in the gym and find better exercises that fit whatever part of the range of motion in a muscle that we're after. And so for most people, I would say it's probably best to challenge the lengthen and mid-range anyway, and especially the mid-range is probably going to get you 90% of your muscle growth results. And now the other goal of understanding the resistance profile is to remove redundancies within your training. So now that we understand that muscles can be challenged at varying lengths, we can look at the exercises we have and see where we are challenging muscles in similar ways and hopefully add a little bit more variety to our training and thus train more efficiently and utilize other ranges of motion that we may get a little bit more results from. And so a lot of times when we think of a change, like minimizing redundancies or doing things a little bit differently, we think of different modalities. So dumbbell, cables, machines, kettlebells, barbells, but we still challenge the same parts of certain muscle groups. So understanding how muscles work at varying lengths can help us better manage load, since at certain ranges of motion we are weaker, which could mean it leads to less overall fatigue, which means fewer potential injuries and maybe even a little bit more gains. So as an example, let's look at biceps training. The bicep is the primary flexor of the elbow. However, it is the secondary muscle group working when training the back in rowing or pulling movements. This normally loads the mid-range of the bicep. So if we are going to add bicep training into our back days, we would maybe do one exercise that loads the bicep in the mid-range, but in order to prevent redundancies, it could be worth doing something like an incline dumbbell bench, or even better, an incline cable, like almost drag curl, because you are putting the bicep in a fully lengthened position to work the bicep at a longer muscle length. Not only that, but with the bench adding extra stability, you can also potentially put in more force output using the bench as a stability measure. So now that we have a better idea of how to use a resistance profile to assign a certain exercise over a muscle strength curve for a stimulative amount of tension, we want to maximize as much force production as we can to that muscle. And this brings us to understanding counterforce. Newton's third law states that every action or force in nature has an equal or opposite reaction. So counterforce is a force that opposes another force. So first we decide what part of a muscle strength curve we want to train. Then we optimize the resistance profile of the exercise to implement what we want to use. And now we want to optimize the amount of counterforce we are using to maximize the amount of tension and force we can produce for a certain muscle. So when we apply force through a particular exercise, we should prepare for a predicted opposing force that responds to our action. This is a fancy way of saying you should prepare for an external weight to pull back, like in the case of a row, to pull back against you after you pull it. Now, whenever I put it this way, I know it seems obvious because it's a law of the universe, but our goal is to make sure that we are optimizing the amount of counterforce we are applying against the weight for the target tissue. And so to do this, we have to understand stability in terms of our exercises. Did a video on this a couple videos ago. Internal stability, so stability from within our own body, and external stability. So all of the stability factors such as your base of support and the stability that's provided from machines. And when I did my video on exercise order over this, so I don't want to go into too much detail, but basically for hypertrophy specifically, we want to minimize the amount of internal stability we are using to conserve energy to drive maximum force to the target muscle against the weight. And we want to use the external stability of machines and benches and seated positions to maximize our output. So we have to understand how and when to use each of these types of stabilities for a given exercise so that we are choosing an appropriate amount of counterforce that lines up correctly for our optimal performance. Now, if you're more concerned with pure strength output or athletic output, then maybe you want to get some of those internal stability adaptations through exercises. But in terms of hypertrophy, there's a reason most good lat pull-down machines have a pad to drive your legs into. So I want you to go out and challenge yourself to do this. Do one set of lat pull-downs, raise the pad up to where you don't use any of it to drive against, and use all internal stability and see how much weight you can do for a set. Rest about 5 minutes, lower the pad, drive your knees into it while you are pulling on a lat pull down, and tell me that you're not able to do more weight. Or you can look at a chest supported row machine. These machines are made with a purpose. So use them to provide the maximum amount of stimulus that you can for the muscle that you're trying to target. This really helped me get a better idea of how to actually work a muscle that I am trying to hit. So basically, I gained better body awareness or proprioception to be able to actually contract and work the muscles that I'm trying to, because these stability pieces on these machines are designed to where you can isolate certain muscle groups more. So now that, we have figured out through Counterforce how to provide more tension, how much tension do we actually need? And this brings me to time under tension. And it's often wildly misunderstood from outdated studies that aren't really as relevant anymore. So when it comes to time under tension, everybody focuses on the time piece, but nobody really looks at the actual tension piece. So the time piece, whenever it comes to time under tension, is more so a byproduct of the proper amount of tension. So the time of tension is sufficient when your reps involuntarily slow down, or your contractions slow down based on the fact that you're getting really damn tired and approaching failure. And this isn't something to get a whole hell of a lot up in arms about, but just understand, if you are using heavy weights, you know that you need to go a little bit slower on the eccentric, the negative or lowering phase, in order to prevent future injury potentially. And your contractions should slow down as a set goes. If you're doing this right, then effective time under tension is a byproduct of effective load and exercise selection. And just a good thought that I give that I think is generally good for most people is, you're approaching failure when your reps start to get up towards maybe potentially 3 seconds in length on the contraction phase, on the concentric phase. Usually that means you're approaching failure. Now, that is a very general thing. That's not specific to everybody, but that's just how I have internalized it, and it's kind of helped me. Now, all of this to be said, that you now want to look at the muscle fiber orientation to line your body up to optimize all that we have talked about up to this point. When we train a muscle, we have to visualize the path of the muscle fibers. In order to train a muscle effectively, it also helps to line up the resistance profile in line with the direction of some of the fibers. Now, some muscles are much more complicated than others. So things like your calves and triceps and even biceps can be easier to see because they tend to just run vertically, and it's pretty easy to apply force directly against those. However, muscles like the pecs and the lats, which are fan shaped, can be a little bit more complicated. So when we're looking, going to the gym, lifting weights, it can be reduced to putting tension through all of these fibers, and knowing how all of these fibers are oriented and how to apply proper amount of force and tension through them is a really great place to start. So when it comes to like lats, for instance, since they are fan shaped, it helps to have multiple different types of lat exercises so that we are ensuring that we are hitting as many of those fibers as possible. So a low row or a single arm dumbbell row or even a chest supported horizontal row is going to hit fibers differently than, say, a lat pull down. So it's important to have some variety in your program for the pecs and lats in muscles that kind of run in a lot of different ways. So if you can take everything that I just talked about, internalize it, start to look at your training differently, you're going to be able to find gaps in places that maybe you were stalling out before. And sometimes what we need to do is take a step back, lower volume, lower the amount of workload, and focus on how good can we make those sets. So I hope this painted a better picture for you so that you can start to ask better questions in regards to your own training. So if you have any other questions or have any other comments on this or anything you'd like to add to this conversation, leave a comment below. I'm super responsive on there. You can contact me, all the contact info in the description. Reach out to me privately if you want. If you have any other specific questions, I'd love to hop on a call and help you out if you need it. So other than that, until next time, peace.